Video, we are going to introduce the critique and kind of what makes a critique a critique. So, first thing you might notice is that it is spelled with a K instead of a C. Well, critique in German means criticism, review, judgment. It's not spelled with a C because it doesn't infer a judgment of assumptions the way that the German word does. Philosophy has pretty much always been in debate. Sometimes it's been as sort of moral obligations, sometimes it's been as arguments that are linear disads, but in the early 1990s, things started to be actually called the critique, and that's where we see the history of the critique sort of found. Some have attributed William Shanahan as sort of the founder of the critique in its sort of modern iterations. There are three essential parts to any criticism. The first is going to be a link argument, and a link argument, i.e. why the status quo or the plan or the AF does something particularly problematic. The implication or the impact, most everybody calls it an impact anymore. Back in the day, people used to call it an implication, but the impact is what bad thing would happen because of the link argument, and C is the alternative, what can be done about it, what should be done about it. One thing to have to be wary about is that with some critiques, they're not always going to be broken up into separate cards, so there might be more than 3 cards. There might be just one long card that has all 3 sort of sections in it that all still form a full and complete critique. The link debate. So when you are affirmative and you are reading critique on the affirmative, what you are going to be doing with the link is you are going to be arguing that the status quo has some flawed assumptions and doesn't do things correctly in the status quo. When you are AF, you will also try to apply the links that you applied to the status quo to whatever arguments that the negative is going to make, whether it's framework, a disad, another critique that they end up reading against you. When you are reading a link on the negative, you are going to present reasons why the affirmative has flawed assumptions, why something they think is foundational to their ideas that are presented in the affirmative is flawed in one way or the other. Implications. This is going to be a description of why those flawed assumptions are particularly bad and why and what those ramifications are, why they're bad, etc. Think about it as in terms of any other impact debate, just like on a disad. It's what is the bad thing that's going to occur because of the link argument, and why is that particularly bad. The alternative. This will be a statement, and it will be kind of generally be similar to a plan text, and it will generally say the word alternative, and it will have a card that indicates what can be done about the flawed assumptions, whether it is rethinking, rejecting, doing something different politically. It's really hard to say, but there are a lot of different ways that an alternative can function. We're going to go over different types of critiques that sort of exist, just to sort of think about what kind of critiques exist in debate rounds, maybe give you a better idea. So the first one we're going to talk about are the language critiques. And what language critiques contend is that language creates reality, i.e. the way we use signs and signifiers dictate how we sort of relate to one another in the world, and that the language that was used by the other team creates oppressive structures. There are lots of different examples of this. Both sexist language and homophobic language argue that things like mankind or the word gay being derogatory are all ways in which we use signs and symbols in order to create a structure to make people relate to the world either in sexist or homophobic ways, impacting out to those oppressive structures. Usually they have rejection alternatives attached to them. The other two down below are different arguments. Apocalyptic rhetoric argues that your use of apocalyptic rhetoric, or i.e. the proclivity towards talking about extinction level impacts, demobilizes the public from actually worrying about those impacts and actually makes them more likely to occur because people won't take action. And threat construction argues that when we think of and talk about other countries as threats, that they have no choice but to respond in kind, treating the United States as a threat, which creates what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the two countries have to relate to each other as if the other is a threat, which causes military buildups and generally turns back sort of usually hegemony type arguments that are being made in debate. The second type of critique we're going to talk about are epistemological critiques. And epistemological critiques contend the way we have accrued knowledge, or the way that we have come to know what we know, is problematic or inaccurate. The way we know that that's true, and the reason we call them epistemological critiques, is because epistemology is the study of how we know what we know, which is why it's called epistemology. So there are a few examples that we'll talk about. The first is the feminist critique of international relations. It argues that the masculine lens in which we sort of understand the way that countries interact with each other, usually via realism, is an inaccurate one and focuses on the macro too much and prevents focusing on the micro level of the actual individuals that are involved in these discussions of international relations. And because of that, it ensures and creates a patriarchal relationship between countries that can lead to a laundry list of impacts. That kind of goes for the same with the critique of realism. There's a bunch of different realism arguments that just contend that realism is an inaccurate description of the way that countries interact with each other, and that inaccuracy makes war and other impacts more inevitable. The next is the complexity K, and the complexity K just argues the idea that we can make predictions about the world is inherently flawed, that the world is too complicated, there are too many variables going on, and that any mono-focused attempt to try to explain and predict the world can never be accurately conducted. And then the third, or the last one, is an identity neutrality argument, which argues that when you understand the world as if identity, whether it be race, sex, gender, sexuality, etc., all of those things are neutral, i.e. everyone is the exact sort of same, and that there's a neutral human that is being talked about and forefronted as to being the good, and what is good for that neutral entity, that what that does is it obfuscates different identities and the way that those identities actually interact in the political world now. For example, it could be that your idea that everyone is race neutral and discussing your policy in those terms neglects and sort of pushes to the periphery the idea that race can interact with those things on a very real and material level and supercharge, recreate, and sort of prop up systems of racist domination. The next form of critique we're going to talk about are ontological critiques. Ontology means the study of being. Being can really be understood as relationality, so how do you relate to something in the world? If you want to think about it this way, think about the difference between how you relate to a chair, which you probably relate to a chair as some place for you to sit, versus a 2 or 3 year old. A 2 or 3-year-old is going to have a variety of different ways that they are going to relate to the chair. They might sit in it. They might use it as something to prop them up to get into something like a candy bowl or something that they're not supposed to be getting into. Or they could use it as a table in which they have their toys sprung out and they are recreating a fortress of some sort, or they are pretending it's a mountain. The point is that the 2 or 3-year-old has a multiplicity of different relationships that they'll have to that chair, whereas adults and older individuals, generally you only have one relationship to a chair at any given moment. And so ontological critiques questions those relationships that we have to things and people inside of the world. Generally, these ontological critiques are arguing that the way we relate to specific things or people is problematic in debate. A couple different examples. The first is fear of death. The way we relate to death, i.e. the way we are afraid of it, the way that we try to push death away and make it go further into the future in order to stay alive as long as possible, causes a lot of impacts to sort of take place, i.e. that we manipulate the environment in order to make sure it's as sanitized as possible so that we can live as long as possible. This would be things like hand sanitizers, or maybe that you are afraid of another country, and because you have that fear that they might kill you, you preemptively think it would be a good idea to attack them first. This is kind of the basis for Rumsfeld and Bush's attack of Iraq during the early aughts. Managerialism argues the same sort of thing, i.e. that it is when we take Western humanistic logic, i.e. that we can control every single aspect of our lives and the world around us, that we manipulate those things in order to solve problems. But that managerialism, that constant manipulation and trying to manipulate everyone as if they're chess pieces on a chessboard, can lead to a plethora of different impacts, whether they are environmental or sort of war-based, depending on the authors that you are reading and what the topic is about. The next type of critique we are going to look at is a metaphysical critique. These critiques critique our understanding of how the world is made up. What makes the world? How is it constructed? Oftentimes, it is a critique of Western Enlightenment humanism. This means that it's a critique of individualism, rationality, science, and the belief that humans can fully control the entire world around them. For example, the God critique argues that this world that we live on Earth right now in the immanent is actually not controlled by us at all, but is actually controlled by God, and that all that we should be doing right now is trying to have a closer connection with God, because everything that is really good about life comes in the afterlife when we go to heaven. And it argues that when we think that we can control and manipulate the world and that God really isn't in control, that's what causes wars, famines, managerialism that produces a wreck of different bad things to happen. Buddhism makes an argument that it really sort of critiques the idea of Western individualism. It says that we are not separate autonomous agents that make our own decisions, but that we are interdependent and co-arising with everything and everyone around us, which means that we are simultaneously influenced and influencing everything around us, and that not understanding that sort of metaphysical assumption, or the fact that the world is made up differently than individualism, causes a lot of problems to sort of take place, i.e. individualism causes things like rational choice theory, competition theory, it's the basis for capitalism. All of those things kind of roll into a metaphysical critique. Taoism also offers some of those same sort of critiques of all of those as well. The next one are structural critiques, and these are what I like to call left of policy, but really sort of policy critiques, and they critique the way that the status quo sort of operationalizes the structures in which we live in. So it will sound a lot more policy-esque, and it won't be as sort of deeply rooted in philosophical jargon. For example, anarchy, state bad is an argument that says that the way we have structured the world around nation states is a problematic orientation to the world that encourages hierarchicalization, encourages taxation, military buildups, and competition between nation states. Capitalism, on the other hand, argues that the way that we have structured our economy is through a capitalist lens that feeds through competition, greed, etc., etc. The best advice is that you have to realize that critiques are just arguments, and when you understand that they're just arguments, you can start breaking them down and start thinking about them for what they are, and start arguing why some of the assumptions that even critiques make are inaccurate ones and ones that don't really have to be worried about. So this has been an introduction to critique.